Welcome back. You're listening to Every Side of Cyber, Protecting Space from Hackers, sponsored by Raytheon on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guest today, Todd Probert, the Vice President for Command, Control, Space, and Intelligence with Raytheon's Intelligence, Information, and Services. Now, Todd, before break, we were talking about the threats that we're seeing, why space is not only important to protect, but how those risks and those mitigation factors all fall in very similar to what we see whether you're working on a ground system, a satellite system, or just your iPhone. One of the things I want to begin with is around supply chain. We're seeing a huge push across government and from Congress with supply chain. Protect it. How do you know you can trust those who you're working with, and the old trust but verify? Where does that, how is Raytheon addressing their supply chain and as you're working with the Air Force and other military departments?
Sure. Jason, it's a great question, and you kind of have to go to how software is developed today. So I've got a 19-year-old kid. He's at the University of Maryland studying computer science. And the way he does software today, and this is a little bit of an oversimplification, if you give them a task, go build me something, the first thing that kids today do is to go get on the internet and find other similar tasks and steal that software. It's called free and open source. To find free and open source components to kind of Frankenstein together a broader piece of code to do whatever functionality. Now, that's an oversimplification and an interesting anecdote, but it's not that different when you look at how we put software together at Raytheon or across the DoD. Much of this software, if you can find something within the commercial industry or you can find something that's free and open source, you're going to bring those subroutines in because they've been proven out and in theory they've been refined for whatever purpose they're made for. But you also need to look at the pedigree of where they've come from and to make sure that there's nothing that's been built into them, so to the supply chain, the supply-based type of thing, that might be a vulnerability that somebody could exploit or that was purposely put in there. So we're spending a lot of time and effort on the assessment of those building blocks that we're bringing together, as well as the overall integrity of the code base that we're fielding on broad systems.
At the same time, what I've heard over the years is open source is more secure than a proprietary because so many people can see what the code is and what's in the code. So I wouldn't say just trust it because you got to verify it, right. But is there a concern that open source is causing problems, or is it just doesn't matter where you get your code from, you got to verify that it's not going to cause you any malware, any backdoors, or any problems?
Well, I think that's exactly the point. So in the past, we might have taken something, a free and open source that's been, if you will, crowd tested across a number of various use cases and accept it as a proven piece of code. Today, much like we do with the code that's developed internally on our teams, we put that same we put that through a pretty rigorous assessment, a vulnerability assessment of the code we develop. In recent years, we've turned that same vulnerability assessment to look at the free and open source and the COTS products that are coming in. Not to say that they're any more vulnerable or less vulnerable than the code we build, but to take the same level of scrutiny across the entirety of the system. Can't point to any one instance that, hey, this piece of code snuck through and opened up this vulnerability. They may be out there, but the point is we have to set a new standard, and we're coding essentially to that standard across the board regardless of the source. And when you look at the new supply chain standards, really that's what we're looking to go do, to make sure that we're holding everybody to the same standard, and that standard is appropriately high for the high consequence missions that we do for the DoD and our other customers.
I think that's a great point around a rigorous assessment of all code, whether it's open source or our own or our partners, because you don't know where the malware is fit in, you don't know where the vulnerability exists until you go through it. Right. And I hear a lot from agency CIOs and industry about automation and orchestration, because codes can be millions and millions, tens of millions of lines, and you can't look at it with an eyeball, right? You or I can't sit there, a machine, and look for a vulnerability. So where does those, if you will, capabilities of automation and orchestration fit in?
Yeah, so let's take automation, and it's a great thread to follow because it picks up where we just talked about from the supply chain side. We're at a state where technology is pretty mature, and you can take a lot of commercial technology and bring it into military or high consequence type of regimes. The question now is, how do you trust it, right? So you put something, you put some autonomy in something that heretofore you've done with a number of people sitting on consoles or actually managing something in a real-time standpoint. and you allow the computers to go do it. There's a trust factor to
Right.
that. How do you prove it? How do you make sure that the way the human's going to operate, that the computer's going to go do it as well? And I'll say first and foremost, Raytheon and just about every single customer that we've talked to very much wants to keep a person in the loop. So we're not seeing, the Terminator type of the type of activities out there, right? The U.S. has been very purposeful in keeping positive control. But there's a number of good cases to go put autonomy and stuff and take people out of the loop. When you put individuals, people into repetitive tasks, they tend to make mistakes. Computers generally always do the same thing, if you program them correctly, the same way every time. So autonomy has its purpose and can go help us move through a number of great things. And frankly, take those precious person hours off of a particular task and get the humans working on things that are more important.
The other piece that is important around this is you can also get through much more code more quickly, because as probably the Air Force and other of your customers will tell you, we needed it yesterday.
Sure.
And if it's going to take you 6 weeks or 6 months or whatever the time frame is to look through the code to tell us we're secure, that's way too long.
Right.
So that's the other benefit, is the speed. And as you said, you're not taking the human out, but the human sees the results of that automation and then can decide, okay, here's a problem, or here's even just a red light had gone off, let's recheck this manually. How much is automation playing into your efforts these days? Is it 50% of the effort? Is it 100% of the effort?
No, so at Raytheon, we're spending a lot of time and effort on our software practices, and that's just it. We are looking to go automate as much of those software practices as we possibly can. So there's a term of art called DevOps in the software area, and essentially that's taking your development environment and your operations environment and essentially slamming them together, right? So building a platform where you develop is identical to where you operate, and then automating your test practices and your software integration as part of that. So if you have automation on the development side, then you can rapidly automate into the operations environment. And we've seen programs that have taken years in the past to develop that we smushed down into hundreds of days, and functionality that we've been able to deliver in literally hours because we've put automation into how we develop software. Now, I think you mentioned it before, right? The way we do it in the commercial world is interesting and fast, but I said it's crowdsourced, or it's crowd tested, right? And you used a mapping application, I think, as a case in point. So if somebody puts out a mapping application and grandma doesn't get to her hair appointment on time because the map took her to the wrong place, that's not good, but crowd testing really only gets you to some level of confidence, let's say in the 85% range. The high consequence things, if you take that to a jet fighter pilot and you're building software for him or her, you can't live with an 80% or an 85% confidence. So that automation really has to get married up with a formal full up operations testing to give you that level of consequence, and I think that's where Raytheon excels. We've been in that high consequence space for many, many years. We're adapting Silicon Valley and other current software practices into our processes, and we're taking that to market for those high consequence customers.
When you said DevOps, I expect you to say DevSecOps, because that's the thing I'm hearing more times now. Maybe 5 years ago, everyone was like, oh, DevOps. Now everyone's like, DevSecOps, and I'm waiting for the next one, right?
That's right.
What's the fourth term they add?
It's all in the word. And I assure you that the security is baked into our automation for sure.
The other piece that also will help you eventually is the move to artificial intelligence, machine learning as part of this automation. Is AI and ML there yet, or are you starting to run some tests about how you can use these kind of emerging capabilities to, again, add more rigor to the code?
Yeah, Jason, it's a fantastic time to be a software developer, and if you look at some of the progress that's been made in the commercial space, we've been looking to go harvest that and bring it to that high consequence space. In the machine learning area, big strides being made in just the large data sets of maintenance data, for example, and prognostics, right? So the analogy I like to use is, my father taught me very well when I was a young kid, and he gave me my first car, and he drilled it into my brain. Every 3,000 miles, you change the oil in that car if you want that car to be there for the line. So that's how I grew up, right? And that was ingrained in how I did things. Now with my car today, I just sit there and wait for the car to tell me, hey, the viscosities of a bad spot. So that's a machine learned algorithm that's baked into the car that allows it. So we're taking those same kind of concepts into the military and the DoD activities. And then there's more exquisite machine learned type of things. We call it synthetic vision, right? We've got analysts that sit and pour through reams and reams of imagery data to go find that, if you will, the proverbial needle in the haystack that we need to go. And that's very taxing on those individuals. And oftentimes there's a fatigue factor that goes into it. So we're trying to transfer that functionality into the machine and allow the machine to do it for us and to find that needle and to do it in a consistent way.
Todd, this has been a fascinating conversation. We're just in the home stretch now, so I want to circle us back around to the beginning of the conversation when we talked space and space systems. We've talked about the supply chain, we've talked about how automation can help, we've talked about software rigor, but there's still threats, and there always will be threats against these systems. Talk maybe a little bit about what is the threat, or what concerns you and Raytheon the most when it comes to the space and space systems.
Yeah, so if you take it to, you look at what happens or how we consume space type of products. We talked about navigation, communication, weather, other things that are out there that we rely on. I mean, it is something that's a fact of our daily lives. The TV weather, forecasts, in fact, are actually another Raytheon system that we fielded for NOAA and the National Weather Service. I mean, that's something we rely on day in and day out, till we take an umbrella to work or not. Or, is there going to be a natural disaster that we need to be concerned about in this particular location? All of that data is coming in. So if you just start to extrapolate the what ifs, what if the navigation signals, weren't appropriate? We're talking about self-driving cars. Well, what are self-driving cars going to rely on? They're going to rely on GPS. We're talking about drone delivery, from Amazon and other folks out there. Well, again, what are those drones going to rely on? They're going to rely on the GPS system. What if that GPS system wasn't there? What if that GPS system was off by a little bit? All of those things then, first can't happen, and then more importantly, might put us in harm's way when you go look at it. What if the communications weren't there? Again, the cell phones, we talked about how reliant we are on cell phones. Well, a lot of that's reliant on communications from space and the timing and all that. So it's that world of what if that I think we need to be concerned about. And I'll take it back to what we've seen from cyber incursions of late, and again, back to the front page of just about any newspaper in any given month. The folks that are out there looking to do nefarious things are getting pretty creative in terms of what things they're going to do. And space, just like anything else in this interconnected world, is something we need to be concerned about.
You come back around to data. You come back around, and we're talking about data here. Really, what we're talking about, because everything is about the data. And we saw just in the last couple of months, the city of Baltimore got hit by a ransomware attack. Is ransomware now starting to make its way into the space and space systems?
Well, so ransomware is really, going at the databases, and most of the databases that are associated with space are terrestrial based. And certainly those data centers are as vulnerable as any other data center out there. And again, I'll come back to the connecting point is it's all about software, and cyber attackers are going after that software. So anywhere there's software, there's a concern.
All right, very good. That's all the time we have for today. So let me thank my guest, Todd Probert, Vice President for Command, Control, Space, and Intelligence with Raytheon's Intelligence, Information, and Services. Todd, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
I'm Jason Miller, and you've been listening to Every Side of Cyber, Protecting Space from Hackers, sponsored by Raytheon on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Raytheon.